Welcome to the Artistic Vision podcast. Today we have the great Dr. Elissa Yukiko Weichbrodt, who teaches at Covenant College in kind of neighboring our part of the world, Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain, Georgia, technically. And she wrote a book within the last year or two called Redeeming Vision, A Christian's Guide to Looking at Art, which if you are curious about, you go to an art museum and you just don't know what to do, it's a super helpful, super practical guide about how to look as a Christian or not a Christian at art, but specifically as a Christian, what kind of different postures maybe we should have, one of generosity and humility, seeking to learn. Her specialty is, she's a practicing artist, but she's in her education, her specialty is kind of contemporary modern art, what she'll say is the art that nobody likes. And so I think you're in for a treat if you're kind of confused, you think, I don't get it. She'll give you some practical advice of what to look for.
Yeah. When she described medieval art, it felt like the way I describe contemporary art. She's like, it's weird. It's kind of don't understand. Like the things that I say about contemporary art, she has done for medieval art. She's come to learn to appreciate it, and even though it's not like her first love. And so I think that it's really beneficial for me to hear from someone like her, and she's brilliant. Yeah. So I appreciated the conversation.
Yeah, not that all of our podcasts aren't practical.
Yeah,
but I think this is like maybe one of the most practical we've done in terms of asking her, just kind of helping us how to go to an art museum and look around and what to look for. I think you'll be
super helpful. Yeah.
All right, here she is. All right, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Elissa Yukiko Weichbrodt.
Thanks for having me.
All right, good. Yeah, absolutely.
You did it.
The Artistic Vision. It's so good to have you. And the first question we begin with is, for all our guests, this first one is, what's your beginning with beauty? So was this a prevalent category in your upbringing? Was it something you appreciated later? I know you're an artist, so did that come early or late, or kind of what's the process for you?
I love this question. It was really sort of beautiful in itself to just think about the story of beauty in my life. I was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii. Spent my whole childhood there until I went off to college, and always loved to draw. So was always really drawn to making things, to crafting things. Was the only sort of artistic one in my family. But I always knew that I had a real sensitivity to things that were beautiful, not just things that people made that were beautiful, but to the natural world. There's so much abundant natural beauty in Hawaii, and not just the spectacular things, but the little things, like the way that sunlight goes through a wave just so and is a very particular color, or the inside of a hibiscus flower, that the way that the light catches on the scales of a gecko. Like all of these things just felt like such gifts to me, even if nobody else seemed to be talking about it in quite that way. I just felt so attuned to all of it. But I also grew up in a context where being a good Christian meant being in full-time ministry, sort of meant serving the church in some very utilitarian kind of way. And so I like to tell folks that my first attempt to sort of integrate faith and art was dressing up for our Awana clubs as a missionary to Japan who illustrated children's Bibles, because that was my best, my best like 6-year-old effort at trying to merge my love of beauty and making with this desire to serve the kingdom. And so it was really freeing later on to learn that I didn't have to choose.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's great. And you now teach at Covenant, which is a
Mm-hmm.
Reformed school, Presbyterian in background.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the Reformed camp I'm kind of come from a Reformed background, and I think identify mostly as Reformed now. But it has kind of a complex history with the idea of like sight or beauty or
Mm-hmm.
art in general. Um, Often churches are bare, stripped down, geared towards listening rather than sight, if I can be so stereotypical. So how's that kind of been for you as an artist in this tradition? And are there any kind of new movements or happenings in those circles that you are excited about?
Mm-hmm. When I think about this, when I think about my relationship to Reformed churches, I'm really struck by how all of the Presbyterian churches that I have worshiped in, have been a member at, have been the homes of artists. So there have been a lot of artists in all of my church communities, which has meant that the churches have also been full of art. When I was in graduate school in St. Louis, our church had a very specific artwork that we would actually hang in the sanctuary during Lent. It was this sort of whirlwind of detritus and chicken wire and barbed wire that was hanging over the communion table. And then Easter morning, it would be gone. Our first church here in Chattanooga, lots of artists were there, a lot of mosaic work, a lot of relief carving as part of the sanctuary space, and banners. And then even my church now, the Doreen Kellogg, a very faithful textile artist and saint, has been making banners for this church for 50 years, and they're all there in the sanctuary. They change with some of the liturgical seasons. And so I feel sometimes like, oh, I just found it. I'm like a magnet for beauty in churches.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I haven't felt the kind of starvation that I think stereotypically you might expect from maybe some Reformed churches or the PCA that Covenant is a part of. But I also think part of it is learning how to cultivate some of that beauty in our own family's worship practices, so that the liturgical calendar is important in our family. We borrow from the Ukrainian Orthodox tradition at Easter and during Lent because of my husband's upbringing. And so there's these threads of just knowing that I am part of a bigger family, and I get to participate in all of the goodness and the beauty that that bigger family has to offer. So I'm doing okay. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. No. Yeah, if you don't mind, I mean, I'm just curious about this personally. Like, how do you mentioned like the family practices, like in the liturgy, like how do you
Mhm.
cultivate that for your own family, your children, that they'd have a sense of that beauty matters, that these things are important to us?
I feel like I'll have to get back to you in 10 or 15 years to see if any of it has stuck, right?
We were hoping you would have all the answers so that we could steal them.
No. But I will say my boys, I have two boys, 15 and 13. And they are very much teenage boys right now. But when it's Lent, they still want to write Pasenka with me. They still want to make these eggs. And every year I make them an egg that has a prayer for them for that year written on it with this traditional Ukrainian symbolism. And this is, I mean, it's like Ukrainian diasporic symbolism, right? So there's definitely some hybridity, some making it of our own, but it feels so rooted in my husband's grandmother and his great grandmother and the communities that they were part of. And so to be able to give that to my sons as something that they can literally hold a prayer in their hand, that matters to them. And when we unpack the eggs every year, they go back and they want to look at their old eggs. They want to hold their old eggs. They remember making some of them. They remember what was going on when they made them. And so I hope that this all sticks.
Yeah.
But it seems like right now it's been really, really gorgeous tethers to something that is bigger than them, to something that's been going on longer than them, folding them into like those moments of, those kairos moments where you're like, oh, there's so much more here than just an egg.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, I think of well, you started your book asking a question about what does your faith have to do with what you see? How does what you see have to do with your faith? And I think back like of my own upbringing, I could sort of point to the way that truth was a little bit more prominent than other things, like, and then goodness. So what we believe, and then how we act. What do you do? Maybe morality. But the thing that a lot of times seem to be lacking is the beauty aspect. So I'm curious to hear how you would answer your own question a little bit more about, like, so what is the aspect of beauty, or what we see, the aesthetic experience, what does that have to do with our faith?
Mm-hmm. So when I wrote Redeeming Vision, I was really thinking about how our theological commitments, how the things that I believe to be true about the world and about myself and about God, how that needed to change the way that I interacted with art. And to some extent, that also meant even art that isn't aesthetically pleasing, right? Like art that is material, art that is evocative, maybe provocative, but not necessarily something that I find pretty or something that I want to hang in my home. And so sort of what I lay out in Redeeming Vision is this idea that it's our faith commitments that say that demand of us that we would take the material world seriously. And you guys, you talk about this beautifully in your book. Like you can't just skip over that, right? So like take the material world seriously, take my own body seriously, take the body of the artist seriously. And this is particularly thinking like historically. But then to also be approaching that with love, with a kind of courageous openness to what you might find there, and then how you might be changed, right? That you're open to transformation that happens through the process of looking. So I think that our faith just I prefer maybe less a metaphor of a lens or a filter for how we look, and more of like a whole person orientation, right?
Yeah.
That it is because we have been transformed by Jesus. Not only do we see better, but we allow what we see to be shaping us,
Yeah.
trusting the work of the Holy Spirit to be a part of that. And what that's allowed me to do is then, my husband likes to joke that everything I studied for my doctoral work was art that people don't like. That my specialty is modern and contemporary art stuff that
Yeah.
that make people uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and that I don't want it in my house, and I wouldn't call it pretty, but I do think it's beautiful because it is moving me towards a wholeness and loving God and my neighbor when I approach it being grounded in who I am in Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. What I see coming through it it's like a generosity or humility.
Mm-hmm.
I hear you saying if you approach it in that sense, even something ugly can help us learn something about ourselves and who we are, even in Christ, if we have
Mm-hmm.
a charitable spirit. Whereas instead of approaching something already critical, just what can we learn from this is sort of the thing
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing. Would you say that's maybe something that marks us as Christian observers or even a Christian kind of art critic approaching a work as opposed to someone who might not have a faith background? What are some of the markers or indicators of someone who is a Christian looking at art? What might be some of the differences that we bring?
Hmm. I think that all of the tools of close looking, of good question asking, of sort of being rigorous in your historical accounting of how an object was made and where and why and all those things, that should be across the board. But it is our motivation and then what we do next, right? And so I think the thing that should mark a Christian art critic, art viewer, is a courageous generosity, right? Like a real belief in abundance, that I can give this object something of my time and my energy and not worry about, oh, is it going to defile me in some way? Is it going to be a waste of my time? Is it, if it doesn't have the right lesson, then is it even worth looking at? And to instead say, no, like I I believe I believe that I am rooted in the abundance of Christ, and I can extend that kind of generosity to these objects that I'm looking at. Um, I've had a number of therapists say that the way I talk about wanting to look at artworks is how you should also look and talk about people. And I think that that has been like a helpful kind of echo in my head
Yeah.
of the way that we want to show love to others. We can actually extend that to these objects as well.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of like the modern project, or like even just what sells or what's popular or what, gets traction, is sometimes just critique. And I just
Mhm.
find that like boring,
Oh
but
yeah.
to see something that you disagree with, but being able to kind of see it in that generous spirit, I think is like the really interesting work that I think, yeah, Christians should be devoted to, and kind of flooding the world with the beauty and goodness that we see in the world, rather than saying that stinks, you stink, do that better. And I think
Right.
that's a really beautiful vision you have.
Yeah, just to be generative, right? I mean, like Mako Fujimura talks about all of us needing to be generative by virtue of being image bearers, and the through line of my book was really, how do we be generative with our looking? We so often think of looking as just being consuming, and I what I want to do in my classroom, what I want to do with my students is to say, no, like now what are you going to make with how you see? How's it going to contribute something to the world now?
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Um, so maybe along those lines, I'm a late maybe bloomer when it comes to the aesthetic conversation. And so I think for me, a hard time, like I could understand, okay, I'm going to go to this church, or I'm going to go to this wing of a museum and look at the religious art. But like in Asheville, we have what I like as a good art museum. It's locally oriented to the Appalachians. But I know going in there, like when I take my students there, it can be like, what? Why am I here?
Mhm.
And so if you were to kind of answer that question, like, why should I go to a gallery? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I think it would depend on how snarky I was feeling on a given day. I think I found it maybe first check in and be like, do you have a body? Okay, good. Then you should go to an art museum because it's going to help make you more human. You know, I really believe that on a fundamental level is that art as this embodied meaning is going to show us what it means to be able to like hold tension. It's going to show us the gorgeous possibilities of the created world. It's going to um, challenge us to have hope for resurrection. Art can do so much for us, can invite us into other people's stories that we wouldn't have access to, can help us imagine possibilities that had not crossed our mind before. So it's like if you have a body, if you're human, like go to an art museum. It'll help make you more human. You might need a little more of like an on-ramp to what you're supposed to do when you get there. But I do think that if you're human, you should go to an art museum.
Yeah. So go kind of take us on that on-ramp, right? So we walk in, we're looking at what may be confusing things or abstract things or landscapes. And we, like, what am I supposed to look for? What am I looking? Yeah, what am I? Give me some kind of, the on-ramp here.
Yeah. So I think there's so many ways to do a museum well, I think that on a very, very practical level, I think that if you are new to museuming or new to looking at art in person, you do need to kind of understand some of your own limits that you like. I can go for hours and I'm good. But even I need to sit down and like have a break once in a while. I don't read all of the text, right? So something I tell folks is a strategy that you might use is to actually just start off walking into whatever gallery sort of like hits your fancy first and just do like a kind of walkthrough of the space. Don't stop and read everything. Don't try to find the most famous thing, but do a walkthrough and pay attention to maybe one or two things that you like, one or two things that catch your interest because you're attracted to them, and then one or two things that catches your attention because you don't like it or you're not sure what to do with it, and then go back and spend time with just those kind of 3-4 objects as a starter. When you're with them, like when you're actually standing in front of one that you want to give that kind of extended attention to, I think you do need to practice slow looking. Like set a timer on your phone or on your watch and say, I'm just going to look at this for 2 minutes and it's going to feel like forever for you to do that. But just to take an accounting of not just the subject matter, but the objecthood, like the facticity of the thing, to pay attention to, and to pay attention to how the artist, how the artwork is directing your attention, right? So like, where am I ending up in this painting? Or does this sculpture want me to stand here and be still? Or does it want me to walk around it? Does it kind of want me to like squat down on the floor a little bit? And really kind of paying attention to the objecthood of the thing. And then I think a great next question is to ask questions about what is familiar or unfamiliar to you about the artwork. So saying, how is this similar to something I've seen before? And why does that connection matter? Or how is this different from what I'd expect? And why does that difference make meaning? Or how does that difference make meaning? And just sort of acknowledging the stuff that we bring with us to an artwork, right? I really love the work of Alma Thomas. She was an African-American painter based in the DC area, who turned to abstraction later in life. And these beautiful patterned, non-objective, colorful paintings that she names after things like Red Roses Sonata or like Old Pond Sunset. They don't look like that, but when you're looking at them, you might think, this kind of looks like a bath mat, or like, this kind of looks like a kid's finger painting. And like recognizing, oh, because I'm making that connection to craft or to something that is non-technical, to something that I have not deemed worthwhile in other contexts, I might not be predisposed to give this Alma Thomas painting my time, but I need to acknowledge that that's the barrier that might be keeping me from being curious, right? Like, what's the thing that's stopping you from being curious? Or maybe you really like the artwork and you're like, oh my gosh, this Albert Bierstadt painting, it reminds me of being in Colorado. It reminds me of being out west. How is that? How did I feel when I was out there? What other associations might I have with that? And so not using yourself as the primary source of interpretation, but acknowledging where you might get in the way of a kind of honest, humble, generative engagement with an artwork is, I think, like that next step. And then you can read the label after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
great.
that's great.
I'm curious if you could think of, and I think you mentioned one maybe, but if you can think of a piece or an artist that maybe repulsed you, or one that you were interested in that you were dismissive of, that now you like have really grown to appreciate, and like maybe not for its aesthetic value, but for what it does how you engage it. I'm curious if anything comes to mind and what the change was.
Yeah. Can I give you two really different ones?
Please.
So the first artwork that just really did it for me is it's a sculpture and installation by the late Cuban American artist Felix Gonzalez Torres, and it's called Portrait of Ross in LA, and it is a pile of candy of colorful individually wrapped candies on the floor of the gallery. And the gallery sign will tell you that the ideal weight is 175 pounds. So you have this placard that says Untitled Portrait of Ross in LA. It's 175 pounds, but it's just candy. And this is like peak contemporary artists don't know anything. Contemporary art doesn't take any skill. Like all of those kind of biases that I had when I first learned about this work were just like all coming to the fore. And I'm grateful that I had a professor who was able to slow me down and to ask me or to give me some context, and then said, you still might not get this, but if you ever see it in person, I like to ask you to give it some time. And so lo and behold, I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's in the permanent collection there. And another part, well, the first thing that really struck me about it in the museum was how everything else was on the wall or on a pedestal or a plinth, but this artwork was on the ground, right? And I was like, oh, that's not what I expect. I don't expect artworks. I don't expect valuable things to be on the ground. And then the security guard who was standing there was encouraging people to take pieces of the candy and to eat it in the gallery. And I knew that was part of the artist's concept of the work, but then to actually be told, no, like reach your hand down, squat down, reach your hand into this pile of candy and take something. So then I'm touching the art, which you're not supposed to do typically. Yeah. And then it's food. So you unwrap it, you can hear it crinkle, you can smell the sort of fake fruit smell of the candy, and then you put it in your mouth and you have this sweetness that dissolves, and you sort of realize along the way, I've just eaten art. And the sculpture has been fundamentally changed because of my participation in it, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And by the next person and by the next person. And the curators will they'll restock this pile at different moments, that they'll kind of decide how much they want to let it diminish. But like just the physical experience of encountering that work, I was just like, what's happening? And then learning that Gonzalez Torres had made it as a way of grieving the death of his boyfriend, Ross, from HIV/AIDS related complications, that I was being invited in to mourning for someone who I didn't know, who died from a disease that at that time I was very unfamiliar with and had a lot of misinformation about as well. But the artwork like cracked me open. It was like because I had participated in this ritual of grief, of this body depleting, but also like being sweet and becoming part of mine. I felt a real responsibility to then go learn more about the artists, to go learn more about the HIV/AIDS crisis and the impact that it had on the arts community in the late 80s and early 90s. It completely changed the sort of trajectory of my my future graduate studies, where I was like, I want to study art that does that. I want to study art that makes you feel something in your body, and where the rupture, the thing that feels so uncomfortable, doesn't have to be a separation, but can instead be an opportunity to step in, right? That it's this, it is, the rupture is an invitation.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, I tell my intro students about that artwork at the end of every semester, because I'm like, I really think art can change your life.
Yeah.
And I hope you have that experience.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, just to like, I mean, the idea that like the grief or the death is like sweet in a sense, like you're taking is sweet. Like, I don't think you don't have to go very far to like get the Christian connotation there, even if it's not a Christian work, or even if the guy who made it is not like. There's the resonance there. I think is just so profound and beautiful. But you said two. You said that was the first one.
Yeah, so that was the first one. But then I started studying like only work like that, right? Like all this stuff in the contemporary wing. And so then but I never studied medieval art. And so I left graduate school loving modern and contemporary, being very at home in like that part of the museum, and kind of looking at medieval church art and being like, that was unfortunate. Like, I don't, just not sure what to do with all of the weird cats. And I don't know, it just felt very odd and quirky to me. And a combination of, I think, growing older and having more room for mystery, of being able to go abroad and actually see medieval artworks in situ, like in churches, the way that they were supposed to be seen and interacted with. And then actually following through on my own advice of being generous and courageous to look at things that I don't like, meant that there's this kind of late medieval wooden sculpture of the Visitation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's not very big. It's like less than 2 feet tall. It's carved out of wood, and it's Mary and Elizabeth. They sort of look like bobblehead dolls. Like it's very quirky looking, and they're embracing each other in greeting. And then the real weirdness is that they both have crystals as their pregnant bellies. Like where their pregnant bellies should be are just these like oval crystals. It's so weird, and it's painted. So it kind of is like, is this, I don't know, medieval precious moments art, I just didn't know what to do with it. But I kept going back to it because I was really compelled by the story of the Visitation. I love the inclusion of this narrative of women bearing witness to each other in a time of vulnerability and uncertainty, but also joy. I love how both Mary and Elizabeth are like affirming the thing that seems unbelievable to each other and the dignity that's part of that. So I just kept kind of going back to the sculpture. And then I actually did some research on it and learned that it was made for a convent. So it was made for women to look at and to contemplate. And in the context of this particular convent, it was the sisters had a whole practice of bearing witness to each other. So they have a book that was written over decades that's known as the Sister Book, where they are basically like making accounts of each other's acts of faith and obedience, but also times when they failed. And a lot of times in the Sister Book, they use the metaphor of transparency or visions of bodies or buildings that are transparent as a way of evoking this sense of longing for something that you can see, but you can't quite grasp hold of. And so one of the ways that scholars have interpreted this Master Heinrich of Constance visitation is that those crystals are kind of a callback to this interest in longing, of desiring the thing that you know is there but you can't quite see as you're bearing witness to each other. And so then I was like, well, then this is just gorgeous, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is a sculpture about women historically bearing witness to each other, but also about Mary and Elizabeth bearing witness to each other. And like, what if I could do that to others now and allow someone to look at me in that way, to be courageous enough to receive that kind of witness in my moments of vulnerability? Can I be transparent? I mean, it's my favorite thing now.
Yeah, that's great. That's amazing. I have a brother book with Alex, and I'm constantly writing
It's mostly critiques. Let's say. Oh man,
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's really good. I know we're at time. There's more I want to ask you, your own creative practice and how you pair that with teaching, but we want to give you the last word. What's something you'd want to share with listeners who are artists who call themselves Christians?
I'm going to tell you that your work matters, and that the way that the care that you give to the things that you make, the belief that you have that what you make matters, the way that you are putting something of yourself into what you make, just revel in how that is a reflection, an echo of God's loving care in making you. That don't just glory in being a maker, but glory in being made yourself, because there is such freedom in settling into that finitude and allowing ourselves to continue to be shaped by the God who made us. And it'll grow our making in really beautiful ways.
That's great.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Elissa, and blessings on things to come. I know you're on sabbatical now and writing, and so we're excited to see what comes out of that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation.